hear a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people in the audience they're interested or they wouldn't show up in this topic. We've seen a lot in the news. We've understand that there have been less and less reporters. We know that there have been a lot of changes. But I want to take it away a little bit from all the articles and all the reports we see about it. And I want to get to the tangible since we are people in newsrooms. So maybe, Charlie, you could start. In your own experience, are there tangible ways you've seen sort of these changes? You're 31 years as a union leader. I'm sure there's been changes no matter what, but of what's been happening here recently.
Well, let me take it back those 30 years. And I will say at the start, first, my thanks to the Institute and to the college for having us here. But beyond that, as I speak, I am indeed someone who spent 31 years at the statewide newspaper. I retired in December, and the opinions I'll express here are my own, but certainly they're shaped by those 31 years. How have things changed? Well, let's try to look back those 30 years. New Hampshire journalism, back in the 70s, we had a strong statewide paper. We had very strong AM and PM papers, 2 cycles. Channel 9 was statewide, didn't have the professionalism it has today, but was certainly there. You know what's missing? 2 things now. To some degree, very strong weekly newspapers. This state was blessed with a great network of weekly papers. Many small towns had 2 papers fighting for circulation, covering everything that happened in the community. Secondly, and I think unjustly forgotten, AM radio across this state. There were newsrooms in AM stations across New Hampshire with a news director and a reporter, sometimes 2, in towns that currently have no local coverage whatsoever. That was a good network which kept a state which at that point was engaged in a very intense level locally and statewide in politics, in every aspect of civic life. It kept that state very well informed. That network has slipped badly in the last 30 years, there's no doubt about it. Some of that are for economic reasons you're all familiar with. Some of it is a change in society. It's not just the web, it started before the web. Civic engagement in New Hampshire and nationally began to slide in the 90s at an alarming rate. It has changed with the web. It has changed with the move of technologies. But I think you'll find, if you look back 30 years, it isn't just newspapers, it isn't just TV. Look at the variety of media we had 30 years ago and look how it's changed.
Grant?
I started, my first full-time job out of college was as the overnight reporter at WGIR here in Manchester. It's a job that doesn't exist anymore. They don't have anybody on overnights. I would change the tape delay of the Rush Limbaugh show and the Dan Pierce show on the reel-to-reel. Technology doesn't exist anymore. The computer does that. And I would feed news from the newsroom into the morning news show. Again, a show that doesn't really exist anymore. Now it's more of a talk show. Moved up to Lebanon, WTSL. We were the most awarded newsroom in the state. A 3-person newsroom covering Lebanon, Hanover, Vermont, 2 state houses, 4 senators, 3 members of Congress. There is no local content during the week on that station anymore. So that job doesn't exist. Spent some time in politics, came back to the world of journalism, and now I'm doing a job that didn't exist when I started. I'm an investigative reporter publishing on a website sponsored by a think tank. Just a channel of journalism that literally did not exist just a few years ago. An independent news organization that publishes almost exclusively on the web. We print out a few copies of our reports now and then and hand them out at the State House, but almost exclusively through email and website. And our audience is 430 people. 400 state reps, 24 state senators, 5 executive counselors, and the governor. If other people read it, great. But we want to make sure that the lawmakers know we're covering them, because we think that elected officials do a better job when people are paying attention. That's how it's changed from my point of view. And all the ramifications of that technology, I think, are what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the evening.
Alicia, those in this audience who pay attention know that one of the things that has changed is MUR has become pretty dominant. But besides that, what tangible ways has the station changed, and has it had to adopt?
Well, I think if we talk about just technology, when we go back to when I started in the MUR newsroom, it was 1995, and we had one computer in the newsroom that would get the Associated Press wires, and we would huddle around that and say, it's my turn, and wait for it and rip it off the printer and then run back to our desk. And you didn't want to lose that piece of paper that you had because you'd have to wait in line again. So there's that. And over time, we got computers, and we all had AP wires on our computers, and from there, our reporters got laptops and Blackberries and things like that. And as they've adapted, so has the way we've covered news. As that technology has grown, so has the way we've covered news. Now we are getting news faster. We are able to email and e-blast out stories and tidbits that we get and say, hey, go to our web. We're not just holding stories for the 6 o'clock news anymore. We're a 24/7 operation, even though we have those same newscasts, the morning newscast, the noon newscast, the 6 o'clock newscast, but you can't hold a story for that anymore because there's so much technology out there and so many people who are covering news, and there are so many 24-hour operations.
NPR has new leadership, been very bold. You can speak a little bit about NPR itself, but maybe also your observations as you travel the country.
Well, first I want to thank the father for his invocation. He managed to make, I've been a journalist for nearly 2 decades now. He managed to make me feel like a tour guide in Pompeii, hopelessly ancient and doomed. Look, on the one hand, I'm a recovering newspaper man. I worked for 10 and a half years at the Baltimore Sun, which was a great paper. At its height, it had 405, 410 journalists, 9 foreign bureaus when I arrived, 15 people in Washington. It currently has no foreign bureaus. It has a staff of maybe 220 journalists. It has 1 person in Washington. My old Washington bureau chief is now doing my old job as the most junior guy on the chain, covering politics in Washington, because that is the collapse of their ambitions, the constriction of their reach. Was a statewide news outlet, is now very much centered around Baltimore. Then again, NPR is a place that used to provide you context and analysis, and I would argue it provides you as fine a report on the nation's political doings, as fine investigative enterprise stories, as fine environmental and science reporting. It has one of the largest foreign reports in the world, and I would say that there are only a handful these days of truly indispensable news outlets in the country. And to my surprise, as somebody who did not ever expect to have the opportunity to work in public broadcasting or to be in radio, NPR is very much one of them. As I go around the country, particularly I might say in red states, states without enormous urban centers that have major news outlets, I find people are hungry for news. They are serious about wanting to understand the world they live in. I think people get written off far too easily. I interview people from Fox News all the time, and they say, oh, you don't care about the red states. And I say, we have 18 domestic bureaus. They're in cities all over the country, cities blue and red. We are loved in Alaska. We are loved when I went to cover stories in Alabama. And it is because people are serious about trying to provide them with context and also provide a safe haven for the ventilation of serious issues, a place where people are trusted to come from all points along the ideological spectrum, be heard and be tested. And I think that that's a powerful combination. So I'm actually proud, even in the 5 years that I've been there, I'm still considered a newspaper guy. I've been there over 5 years now. And even in that time, you've seen a tightening of standards, an intensity of coverage, a swiftning of pace. And my hope is, my belief is, and people can take otherwise, I'm speaking for me here, that NPR is fulfilling its mission better than it has because of that seriousness. You talk about changing opportunities. There's obviously the web, even as there's the cracking apart of traditional media, like my old paper in Baltimore. There's also the emergence of new things like Politico, like not-for-profit institutes that subsidize research and reporting. The notion of what a trusted and authoritative source of news and information is more elastic than it used to be. And I think you're going to see a lot of partnerships, and I think you're going to see a lot of new outlets emerging in that way. And that's really important You can also reach across borders that you couldn't before. I can now read The Guardian or The Times of London at a few keystrokes. You know, it would have taken a week for one of those publications to get here before. That is a value added that you simply couldn't have. I'm a big Angels fan, which I know is not popular among Red Sox Nation, but you know, I can read the LA Times every morning, and believe me, I do, through my computer. This is a value. People are hopelessly concerned about what happens online. The world of PCs is actually not good for radio, because radio, you kind of want to be able to drive or do dishes or, you know, get your kids into bed or whatever. Well, the reality is, actually, mobile may be great for us, because mobile's not so easy to watch her fine news programming on, but it might be great to listen to if you plug it into your ears. So this next generation may be great for us even more than it's been. So, you know, people say, isn't it terrible that? And I say, well, it may be terrible that, but it could be pretty fantastic if. I think there's a lot of changes, and sometimes very much in very stimulating and interesting ways.
Which is a perfect segue where I want to go next. Alicia, you talk about computers changing and your platform, and you obviously have your afternoon webcasts and all that. But why should the average Joe, why does the average Joe care about this? And why does it matter to them?
Well, people are hungry for information, I think, and we're just consumed with this technology and wanting to know what's going on in the world. And so I think it makes it difficult for users and viewers and readers to be able to consume everything, and it makes it hard for us to know where that line is. But it's very important because we can get that word out to you at any time of the day, and we can be anywhere, and you can all take part in it, which is probably another topic. But that's something that we're wrestling with right now, is getting our viewers and our users incorporated, because as you know, anyone with a cell phone can shoot a picture or take some video, and you can be somewhere where maybe we're not, and help in that coverage and participate. And so that's something that we're playing with. How do we do that and incorporate it into our newscast? And where's the line between this user participation and our trained journalists?
What do you think?
If you're a consumer of news, you're not particularly upset at the state of news right now, because you're getting more outlets and more information than you ever have. It's easier to find out information on your topic. You don't have the authorities telling you what the news of the day is. You're consuming it yourself, and you're getting it through word of mouth. I every day read articles that I never would have come across or known about because friends of mine email them to me or link it on Facebook, and I can find more information. So as a consumer of news, I am thrilled that information is out there. But if you're trying to make a living giving away your product, it's a challenge. Now, TV's had to deal with that since TV started. They give away their product for free, and they pay for it through advertising. But the new technology not only allows that information to get out there, it allows consumers to avoid the advertising, not just avoid Dan Rather if they prefer Peter Jennings. They can avoid that revenue stream that gets them the content. So I think the worry is, are we going to lose that infrastructure? Are we going to lose the funding base that pays for people to be professional reporters as opposed to just hanging around and finding out what's going on from your friends?
What's lost, Charlie?
Well, there are two things at risk here. One, as Grant just pointed out, is the economic model, which you all know about. I'm not going to walk through the problems there. The second, though, I think is more of a social change, in that in the past, the news media, traditional news media, has been looked at for its ability to edit, to moderate, to curate the flood of information, and after due consideration, pass it out with their added credibility, added value to the wider audience. What's happened now, of course, is that that audience has become empowered to choose their own news. In many cases, not all, as Grant suggests, yes, indeed, they can go to original sources. They can find the news directly. There are two ways now that break down that new pattern. One is whether they go through aggregators, such as Google News, Huffington Post, whoever else will bring in many sources into one, bypassing the traditional editing functions. Or secondly, will they take the self-empowerment, and will the audience choose only to listen to those voices providing news, analysis, and information that fits their previous worldview? That is perhaps one of the most dangerous parts we have here, looking ahead at society. As America, in an era in which there is so much information available, chooses to almost hunker down and focus segment by segment on the news and information that fits what they want to hear. That is what we're really looking at as a danger, not just to the news business, but to society beyond.
David, are we in a crisis moment for the industry?
I mean, you know, there's a debate, is journalism in crisis, or are there specific news outlets that are in crisis because of their financial situations? One thing I would add, and it's not a particularly fun fact, and it's not a sexy fact, but it is true. If you look at a number of the major newspaper companies that are in most trouble, a lot of them are in trouble because of decisions they made financially to take on exceptional debt they couldn't sustain. Has nothing to do with journalism, has nothing to do with how it's financially structured. It has to do with debt they took on. So for example, my old employer, the Tribune Company, the controlling owner of it, who's just trying to emerge from bankruptcy, put down $400 million of his own considerable wealth to obtain a company that then was leveraging $13 billion of debt. You know, so that the LA Times and the Baltimore Sun, the Hartford Courant, some very proud papers, shed hundreds of employees apiece in significant measure because of financing decisions he made. That's not really linked to this. Not in any way to gainsay the fact that there are real structural problems. You know, classified ads allowed newspapers to print money in the way that in election cycles TV stations get to print money for political ads, and that went away with Craigslist, and it went away with more nimble online competitors, and newspapers were very slow to adapt and deal with that, and there's no reason they should own that. It is a time when I would have said a couple years ago it was crisis. Last year, one of the first stories I did in '09 was I went up to Hartford, Connecticut. I did a story that said, okay, what would happen to the city of Hartford? What would happen to the state of Connecticut if the current would simply go away? It's a paper with a very rich tradition that's been whittled down, but is still by far the largest generator of news for and about
One of the
Connecticut.
oldest newspapers in the country, right?
It is the oldest continuously publishing
We have
newspaper
the New
that's
Hampshire
a
Gazette, so
daily.
I don't wanna-
That's a daily in the
Right.
public. If you cross the T and you take a left,
All right,
on,
all
you
right,
know.
all right.
So, but that's what it claims anyhow. So I thought to say, let's do the exercise. And why do you do that? Well, there are 3 Fortune 50 companies, I believe, that are based in Hartford. It's a state capital. It is a poor city and one of the wealthiest states in the country. I thought there's a lot of rich stuff to cover here. What would happen if it went away? And so I sort of played that out, and I talked to people. One of the most fascinating moments was when I talked to, I think it's called the Stage there. It's a local regional theater base there, very distinguished. A lot of plays opened there before going to Broadway, original plays, Horton Foote and others. She said, we even like the bad reviews because A, they give us some feedback, and B, the bad reviews let people know we're here. We rely on that as much as anything else. And there was just something about the news ecology that said things would change considerably. And then from that point on, I said to my bosses, we have done the story of the death of newspapers. Let's talk about the life and evolution of the news business, because there's so much that is so interesting happening there that it's a time of tumult, and it is a time of crisis, but out of that crisis are opportunities where nimble, thoughtful, sometimes courageous, sometimes increasingly self-interested people are getting into the business and figuring what piece of it can they own, what value can they add, what revenue can they siphon off for themselves. Sometimes they're parasitic, sometimes they're creators, and we are in a time of great change. So to me as a journalist, it is staggering and at times creates great sorrow in the dislocation it creates. Friends of mine losing jobs. Incredibly talented, brilliant people losing jobs that I just can't conceive of. And at the same time, as somebody studying and reporting on this happening, it is so intriguing. It's incredible to watch this unfold. And I don't think anybody knows fully how it plays out, but it should be a time of great experimentation. People should take chances, and it should be okay for not everything to work out.
And for television anyway, speak broadly. Have you guys been insulated on this, or have you felt the effects also?
No, I think that we felt the effects. I think everybody has. It's just you have to reinvent what you're doing. You have to be looking for what that next step is. And you have to be aware of what's happening around you and what consumers want. And you can't just think about people in the city of Manchester, New Hampshire. You have to think more broadly than that, because anything that we put out there now is seen globally. And not to say that we're trying to reach anybody other than our core New Hampshire viewers and users, but we have to be thinking about that, and we have to be thinking about, okay, what's next? what's the future, and what are we planning for. It's a really interesting situation to be in. It's a great time to be a journalist. Even though it can be a little scary, it's a great time to be in this business because you have to be thinking of that next innovative step.
You know, Grant, David talked about taking chances and risks. And like you said before, your job didn't exist when you first got into journalism. Talk about the environment that allows something like you're trying to pull off to be a success. The media environment.
People are desperate for news. They want to know more about the world around them. And quite frankly, when newspapers and TV and radio had a monopoly on their particular media, they didn't have to provide that good a product. They were the only game in town. You know, you've got the big printing press and all the delivery trucks. You've got the FEC or FCC mandated monopoly over a portion of that broadcast spectrum. You didn't have to compete, and so your content suffered. And what we're trying to do is not compete directly with those news outlets, but supplement them and look at the content that the internet can provide. The internet has done something wonderful. It has broken the time-space continuum. Television is limited by time. Newspapers are limited by space, and the internet is either. We can put stories of any length, we can put videos, we can put audio, we can put original documents that you can then look to as much as you'd like to. So what allows me to exist, beyond the generous donations of foundations that have paid my salary, is an audience that is desperate for content. And it's a small, intensely interested audience that wants to know more about the workings of state government. And so we go up there I show up with my tiny little video camera and my laptop, and we shine a light on state government. It's really, really boring. If you have trouble sleeping tonight, I highly recommend my 7,000 word piece on cash flow in New Hampshire. It is deathly dull. But there's good information there on how we actually write checks in the state of New Hampshire. And it's something that the Union Leader or WMUR, quite frankly, would have people storming the battlements to get off the air as soon as possible. But we don't have the time and space limitations. We can do that without sacrificing, the funny little videos that we put up on the other side of the website. We see an audience that wants content. Content matters. Used to be that distribution matters. Distribution doesn't matter anymore because everything's free. And so if we don't have content, we'll go away. And I think newspapers are realizing that, and television stations are realizing that they need content to survive.
Charlie, you talked in the beginning about the loss in this state of weekly newspapers and AM radio. In terms of the news business in this state, combined with the lack of quantity of information, are we at a crisis point here?
Oh, I think we're at a crisis point. I don't think there's any doubt about it. I think that you have a crisis point at any time when there is as much of a revolution in any technology as we are seeing right now in communications technology. However, a crisis can give birth to wonderful new things. I've given some of the grim side of the picture in my previous responses here, but what Alicia said earlier about listening to consumers, I think, shows the brighter side of what can be happening here in New Hampshire and beyond. I think the news media gave lip service to the importance of this communications revolution for the past 10 years plus. And it wasn't until some near-death experiences for papers small and large, for news media of all sorts, that it went from talking the talk to now beginning to really understand that major changes must be made, and those changes have to be built on a clear understanding of what consumers are asking news media to bring them in this new world. My thought is that yes, indeed, there is hope looking ahead for news media that can identify who their audience is and how to reach them. Here in New Hampshire, I think that means a reaffirmation of local coverage, be it for statewide media or for small town media. I think the better a job media does of understanding who that local audience is, bringing them focused information of all sorts, and then tying local advertising to it, doing it in new ways, taking advantage of the new technologies. This is going to be a different marriage, and it's going to force giving up certain things that newspapers, for instance, have been strong at in the past. You'll see less pro sports coverage. You'll see less national coverage in newspapers in 5 or 10 years, I'm quite sure. But I think that if that is replaced with a recommitment to local coverage, that is where the editing function can provide what the consumers are going to want.
You know, Charlie, combined with what David was talking about in terms of is the news business in a crisis or journalism itself having two different answers, and you talked a little bit about the inflection point of new technology. Are there other questions that we're trying to solve here in all of this confusion? What question are you looking to try to be solved?
I'm trying to determine what editors, news directors can do to add value to the information that passes through them. Are they simply aggregators, or are they able to find ways to package and tell stories in better ways? I think that that's the key, understanding how to take advantage of new technologies to use the skills of a newsroom and of trained editors, no matter what your base technology, be it print, be it electronic. As it goes onto the web, I think that we still haven't seen the true breakthroughs in how these stories are going to be told, how they're going to be packaged. That's the question, how best to identify the opportunities, take advantage of them, and tell those stories in better ways for the local community.
David, is there another question we're trying to solve in all this confusion?
Well, I think with the fracturing apart, it build a little bit on what Charlie's saying. There's the great old saying by the late Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, people are entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. I think we're in an age where people feel they're entitled to their own facts. And I think that the real question with the loss of authority of the big three networks and the fracturing apart, and people aren't reading newspapers as much or as closely or in the same place, is there's not a common agreement about the facts they're going to argue over and have opinions about, and I think that's a real issue. We now have a flood of information coursing through our broadband connections, right? You can look at PDFs of documents, or you can look at spreadsheets and the original statistics, and you can find it then mediated to you 1,000 different ways from 1,000 different outlets. And as all of those outlets are tempered a little bit by critics, and I think rightly having to be more responsive to their audiences, rightly being challenged so that it's not simply that Walter Cronkite gets to say it and it's true, it's that it has to hold up to some scrutiny. I don't think that they're common fact-based that we're arguing over at the moment. So for me, the question is, the relationship between raw information, between what is presented as news, between what is opinion or analysis, and what point at the cycle these slices of data come at you. I think that's the great question that the media isn't able to resolve in the way that it once did, because it was top-down directed. This is what you know, now go discuss.
It's no longer the case that what was A1 in the New York Times, the lead story up in the corner, would be the lead on all three network newscasts. And you mentioned that the facts are in dispute. The facts have always been in dispute. It's just that we had a referee to decide them before the end of the news cycle. And it was the bureau chiefs at the three network news sites. It was the editor of the New York Times and the Washington Post. They got to decide what the facts were. And I think what we're seeing with a distributed information model is finally the death of the myth of the objective journalist. Never existed. But for 50 years, we thought that reporters were objective, they were just reporting facts. Reporters report perspectives. Doesn't mean that they're trying to give you opinions, they're reporting the facts from where they see them, to the best of their ability. And I try every day to fight against my own biases, but at least people know where my biases are coming from when they read my coverage. And if we can shatter that myth that somehow somebody tells you what the facts are, maybe we can get better news coverage. Maybe we can get beyond the very simple news coverage of John Lynch says this and John Sununu called him an idiot. It's a very easy news story to write. You just take what other people say, you print it, you put it out there. But because journalists have tried so hard to maintain this veneer of objectivity, they don't look beyond it and say, well, maybe what John Lynch said was right, maybe what John Sununu said was wrong. Last week, the State of the State address, John Lynch had an applause line that, and we did it in the worst economy. In 2009, we balanced the budget. Everybody claps. They didn't balance the state budget. And nobody was reporting that. We put it up on our page. And a day later, people started reporting the fact that actually we had an $80 million deficit last year. And because our newsrooms don't want to challenge this, they just want to pass along, this is what they said, this is what they said, we're not taking sides. You didn't get the actual fact that, we didn't balance the budget. So by trying to be objective, we were leaving out facts.
I would say that that's, if I might take slight issue, that's, I think there's a confusion out there abetted by Roger Ailes and Fox News, but nonetheless a confusion out there between fairness and balance. And they're two totally different things. I did a story on a guy who was making claims about a professor at Johns Hopkins, tenured professor of sociology, making claims about racial disparities in IQ and some other things that the mass body of scholarship, which I had to sort of dive into astonishing length, vitiated against. And I went to my editor and said, look, I'm going to do a profile on this. I'm going to say why it is that people take issue with this, and I'm trying to, it's not going to say, and it throws up. Some people say blacks are not as intelligent, and some people say they are. So we'll just figure out. But it's more nuanced, but it was a complicated story. And my editor looked at me and said, I'm not paying you to be a stenographer. He's like, I want you to go out and report the story. I want you to be the best informed person in the state of Maryland about this. He's like, and you go and you report what you find and you present it to readers. I want you to make the strongest possible case for whatever your findings are, and I want you to lay it out in such a way that people can evaluate the strength of that argument. But balance is not one person says it's day, one person says it's night, and then you've done your job. Objective is a tough word. I mean, in England, they have a funny, a system that's almost the inverse of ours. Sky News, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, a sister outlet to Fox News, and the BBC, on the whole, basically avoid ideological positions, right? So it's completely different than, say, Fox News in prime time and MSNBC in prime time. The newspapers, it's pretty clear where they're coming from. You've got the Times of London, the Sunday Times, basically on the right, the Telegraph, basically on the right, the Observer, the Independent, and the Guardian on the left. And these are basically respected newspapers on both sides with a fairly clear ideological outlook that is strongest in the editorial pages but permeates the news pages as well. But they do their reporting and they're respected there. It's a different model than what we have. So it tells you that it's not, or that what we aspire or claim to aspire to have here. It tells you it's not immutable. There's nothing in law that says that we have to do this the way we do. But I think one can at least take the outlook of the idea of fairness without having to do the false, non-calling of people on stuff and the falsity of balance, I think, that gets journalists into sort of lazy patterns that you're describing.
Charlie, you want to weigh in?
I'll say that the idea that only now is the idea of objectivity in reporting being questioned, that doesn't ring entirely true to me. I think if you go back decades, let's take the Boston market, for instance. The idea that the Boston Globe is primarily a liberal voice in Massachusetts, and the Boston Herald, or going back further, the Record American, was more of a conservative voice, that's not new. That's gone back generations. I think that the public has long had an ability to understand that whatever media you're reading, whatever media you're listening to, needs some sort of a filter. I don't think that's new. I do think what is new is the move to what David's talking about. The idea, I think, is becoming more settled in this country for pro or for con, that indeed the British model of news media that represent a certain worldview, and that can be open and acceptable. That's newer here, that it doesn't seem to be ashamed to show itself. And it's going to be a real difference in this country. There are pluses, but there are also minuses, as I suggested before, by reinforcing one's pre-existing worldview.
And I think you need to be your own filter. As a consumer of news, you need to be active. Now, it's very easy to just say, well, I'm just going to watch Fox News and whatever Neil Cavuto or Glenn Beck says is right, or only listen to Rachel Maddow because she's the only one that's telling the truth. I'm never going to tell you that all you need to be an informed citizen is to read New Hampshire Watchdog and watch the Weather Channel. I mean, you better consume the local paper and the local TV and the local radio and all the national outlets, and come to New Hampshire Watchdog and maybe get a perspective you hadn't thought of, maybe get an investigation that we put a lot of time and effort into, and maybe get a link to a paper you don't read, because you don't get the Portsmouth Herald, but they had a really good editorial or a really good article, and I put a link to it. The nice thing about being foundation-based and not advertiser-based or subscription-based for us is we can put up the news that we think people need to see, and we don't need to compete with somebody. We love driving eyeballs to what other people would see as our competitors. So I think as the financial interest is to get as many eyeballs as you can as much of the day as possible. But as a consumer, you have to fight that, and you have to make sure you consume news from a lot of different perspectives.
I'm going to ask one more question, and if you have questions you want to ask, now's a good time to start lining up. We heard a little bit in the beginning about the question of sustainability. Are there models that you're looking at, or do you just believe that this is a recession, it stinks, we'll bounce back with some changes? Talk on the issue of sustainability. Maybe Charlie, you could open up a little bit about it in terms of maybe mistakes made or not. Maybe just of things you're looking around now that you're out of the game a little bit and very interested and very educated observer.
Well, I think that the mistakes that were made at every level of news media. I think the failure to realize the depth of the revolution that was going on, looking back at now with 5 or 10 years perspective, remains stunning. David pointed to the companies that had made terrible decisions about going into debt. That's very true. But there are very few real success stories to look at in the media at any level of any sort in the last 10 years. Nobody put their finger on how to adjust to the changing technologies and the changing society that was going hand in hand with those technologies. That was the greatest mistake made, and nobody had the right answer. I don't want to sound as though there was one simple answer out there that should have been followed. Even now we look back and we say, how could companies that had followed one economic model for a century in cases of newspapers suddenly adjust quickly to such a radical change in their revenue picture? It may be unfair to say you should have found a way to do it, but I think it's really interesting to look around the country and say, nobody got it. Nobody found a way to hold their entire audience. That means to me it was a bad business decision across the entire industry, but at the same time it was a social change that perhaps it was asking too much of them to adjust to that quickly.
Foundation's the answer?
I think we're part of the picture. I don't think we're going to take over the news business, but I've always said that journalism is an activity and not a club. If you're doing it and you're reporting, then you're a reporter, and be judged by the content of your stories. The First Amendment contains freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and they're together for a reason. So I think that an independent, foundation-based, opinion-based, subscriber-based, advertiser-based, however you can figure out a way to put information into the world is a good thing.
How do we create news that it is sustainable?
We have to pay attention to what people want. We can't look. We have to look at our mistakes and say, okay, maybe we didn't look far enough ahead, and we need to keep looking further and further ahead, and we need to see what all of you want. It's overwhelming what's out there. The amount of information is just overwhelming, and it's our job to sift through some of that and say, okay, we're a local television station, and how do we give people what they want? Well, by listening to you and trying to put our finger on what it is that you want and how you can participate, because the fact of the matter is people are going to participate more and more, and we need to figure out how to integrate that into what we're doing every day, both on television and on our website. It's really, there's a line there for us, but we need to do both and figure out how to do it and how to get you involved, but also to keep our trained journalists as the filter, as the fact gatherers, as people with those perspectives in places where you might not be able to go. So we have our work cut out for us, but I think it's going to be a fun road.
Do you think it involves more participation from viewers, as you were saying before?
I do. But
Beyond the free video content, but what do you mean by that?
Well, we need to know what people want. We need to know what it is that you are looking for. And part of that might be for us to be even more local than we are now, to give up a little of that national coverage that we do and get into your towns. But we need to know from all of you, we need to listen. And not just go out there and say, hey, we're the source. We know what everybody wants, and so this is what we're going to give you. We need to, if you're looking for that local news, for us to be in the town of Greenland covering a story that we say, maybe it doesn't have appeal statewide. Well, maybe it does. Maybe it's relative, and we need to stay relative. We need to stay relevant in that way of just really, really keeping our eyes and ears open to what you want, because there are so many sources out there that we can't lose ourselves in that and say, oh, you can get that national story from CNN, from NPR, from the New York Times, so we need to find our niche.
David, you see entrepreneurs all around the country. You also see great media institutions struggling with issues of sustainability. Yet they have great advantages and a lot of institutional knowledge and credibility and authority. Where do you see these sustainability questions heading? I'm not particularly asking for you to have the model, but what do you think is interesting?
Just as well.
And what do you think is interesting, and how should we think about it?
As I said earlier, I think there's going to be a lot of experimentation. I don't think the same things will work in every market. I think you're going to see a lot of news organizations decide to find areas in which they decide to be authoritative, areas in which they're going to define what it is to be about the environment in this state or community, or about politics, or about popular music or whatever it is, and they're going to identify those areas of expertise, and then they're going to plug in with others that may have other areas of expertise and say, we're going to partner with you. You might be a competitor, you might not be an old-fashioned news organization, but we're going to supplement what we do with you. The New York Times is doing an experiment right now in Brooklyn and in a couple of villages in New Jersey, that seems like you know about, where they're taking graduate students from the City University of New York School of Journalism, and those students are essentially curating citizen submissions. They're editing things done by non-professional journalists who are writing about their city. So it's at once contributed by citizens, unpaid I might add, and at the same time it's edited by somebody with something of a professional, these are grad students, so something of a professional training. And they're putting it not in print much, but on their blogs serving those communities. This is allowing the New York Times, which does not have the manpower to cover all of the hundreds of communities in the tri-state area, to gather greater information, present more narratives about the people, the lives that they're leading. This is something which 15 years ago the New York Times would have turned its nose up at. I don't think even the mighty New York Times can afford to do that anymore. It's got to try things out for size.
Now, James, I wanted to get your perspective on that question, though. You've been giving away political coverage to political junkies for a lot of years on a bunch of websites, and a month ago you started selling that information to subscribers. Are there enough political junkies in New Hampshire to make that sustainable?
Well, we're finding out so far. I mean, my experience has been that fundamentally there is a very small group of political junkies, right? It's an audience I got to know pretty well over the 7 years I've covered politics here, but it's no more than 1,500 people. So my price point for my particular site had to be pretty high, but what's interesting about it is I'm not, what I'm trying to do here, people see as an experiment, and I know David knows this, but in terms of a statewide political newsletter, these things exist in about 21 states. There's an exciting experiment in Arizona, the Arizona Guardian, which is also charging for content. Some charge up to, in Massachusetts, State House News Service is $5,000 a year. But it serves a niche. And one thing I find rewarding as a journalist, if you're at the Boston Globe or Des Moines Register where I was, you can type up something and it goes out into the outer space. And here you really know who's reading because you can see who's logged in. And it actually changes the mentality. It's what does so-and-so want to read about in the next hour? So it does change my relationship with my own readers. But so we're going to take some questions. Two rules. One, give your name. Second, please ask a question. And not statements. Go ahead, Jack.
Well, may we preface a question with a statement?
How short? That's the preface.
Jack Kenny is my name. A couple of points I'd like to make. One of them has to do with the way in which the major media, and especially in the major markets, tend to block out minor party candidates, so much so that David Nyan, much to his credit, when he was writing for the Boston Globe, said, "What are we, bouncers at the two-party nightclub?" And I thought that was a very good question. So I'll throw that out to you. The other point I'd like to make and question I'd like to ask is that the major media, I think, fits the description. I don't know whose phrase it is. I think it was Peggy Noonan coined the phrase, the herd of independent minds. You all ask questions about the money, the polls, what will Senator Claghorn say? Nobody asked the question that should be paramount at an institution like this. Where in the Constitution do you find the authority to do what you are proposing to do? That is a showstopper at a press conference. I asked that question of Vice President Gore, and I got from him the longest, blankest stare I've ever seen on the face of anyone who is not Bishop McCormick. So, why don't we ask that question? I asked that question, one final point. I asked that question of Dante Scala when he was a professor here. I said, where did Judd Gregg, what congressional responsibility was he fulfilling when he got the millions of dollars to build this place, the New Hampshire Institute of Politics? And what I got for an answer was, well, Jack, you harp on that all the time. He never gave me an answer. I have yet to get an answer to that question. So, why don't we ask about the Constitution, particularly at an institution like this where I've yet to hear the question raised by anybody but me?
You mentioned the two-party system. We were dispatched. One of the things that the Franklin Center, which helps organize me and my counterparts at other think tanks around the nation, does is helps network us. Well, so a group, the Americans for Limited Government Foundation, borrowed our expertise and manpower, and we pretty much airdropped a dozen investigative reporters from around the country into Massachusetts to cover the last couple of days of that Senate race. And one of the things I found was, it was Brown Coakley, Brown Coakley, Brown Coakley. Great political story, phenomenal political theater, 3 candidates on the ballot. So we called the other guy. He was named Kennedy. He was a libertarian. And he actually returned my phone call because the Boston Globe, I don't know, maybe they did one piece on him a month ago. TV stations aren't going to have him. He wasn't in the debates.
Yes, he was.
Oh, he was in the debates?
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, good for them. And we did a story on him because he was on the ballot. He was a choice that people had. He wasn't going to win. He knew he wasn't going to win. But it's very important that we not get into covering politics like it's sports. And that's what we do. We don't cover politics at my particular website. We cover policy. And if candidates disagree about policy, we'll give them coverage.
If I can follow quickly on that, I've had the good fortune to work with Alicia and James before on debates, and I think they would both back me up in saying that I always push, as we're preparing debate questions, to try to stay away from the sort of horse race questions that Jack is criticizing and focus on policy. But I'll say that there is time for horse race coverage, and if there had not been horse race coverage in Massachusetts the first week in January, we wouldn't have known what was happening out there. I think most of us came into that race with a belief as observers. Coakley's going to walk away with it. If it hadn't been for the press's horse race coverage, we wouldn't have seen that coming.
Please.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth Fiala. My question is whether we have lowered our standards for journalistic integrity, veracity, and quality with the advent of the internet and citizen journalists, or whether it's been the reverse and we've been able to kind of, heighten our standards for having the story on the ground. I don't know what you might have to say about that.
You go with David?
Yes to both. I would say that news organizations are able to draw upon resources never before available to them. If you thought about the protests in Iran in December and previously in the summer, journalists were there for what was supposed to be a tidy little exercise in Iranian democracy, and they were quickly tossed out as their visas expired when the authorities realized something else was happening. And people, as we all know, were able to obtain, video and photographic feeds taken from cell phones throughout the city, showing the tumult, the oppression, the real backlash by the authorities against people who are protesting the results, the suppression of a voice of a large body of people, and that simply wouldn't have been available without that kind of technology. It could have taken weeks to smuggle stuff out like that, and I think that news organizations had to vet that very carefully, and there were discussions inside NPR, inside the New York Times, inside CNN that were very serious about taking people who knew Tehran intimately, some people who are native-born Iranians, and saying, okay, is this the right intersection? Does this match up to what you think? Is this actually that ministry? To make sure that what they were presenting was accurate on the air. At the same time, information comes so fast and so furious that things are thrown up on the air, and it's almost as though you almost never see a correction on CNN. What they do is they say something a bit different than it was 2 hours ago, and they often elide the fact that they've done that. There'll be a little bit of saying, we're just going back to something to get something quite right, but what they're not saying is, by the way, folks, we got this wrong. Now, that's something I have as a former print guy and as somebody who works at NPR, where we do corrections on a once-a-week basis. We make sure people know about them. I take some issue with that. But nonetheless, it's not like that has gone, it's not that their standards at CNN have gone downhill, and I'm just using CNN as an example. It's that the flow of information is coming at you like a fire hose, and people are trying to grab onto it, and the news cycle, as a result, has accelerated, and they're on to the next thing, and they're on to the next thing, and they're trying to beat the websites like Politico or FoxNews.com or what have you. And so it's I think our reporting is enhanced, and I think it is complicated by the advent of the internet. I think the involvement of more voices cannot be a bad thing, and yet it has undermined our ability to be heard and to speak clearly and to think clearly. And thinking clearly is pretty important for a journalist, but it's become a lot more complicated.
I don't know that we've lowered our standards. There's always been crappy reporting. Most sitcoms aren't funny. Most new songs are unlistenable. And there's a lot of bad news out there. And the professional journalists love to degrade the credibility of citizen journalists, but ultimately judge them by their product. Yeah, most websites are stupid, but the internet isn't all about people's cats. There's lots of phenomenal user-generated content out there. More information is better information. So yeah, there's more of the lousy stuff because there's more of everything, but it also pushes the highs higher, and ultimately we get better reporting because of competition.
We ask for your help. We say, hey, if you're out there, help us out. We can't be everywhere, and we're not going to say we can be everywhere. We try to be in as many places as we can, but all of you can help us, but we have to use that filter that we have and the knowledge that we have as journalists and say, okay, where did this photo come from? What's the information behind it? And we still need to follow up on that, and that's critical. And it's really important for newsrooms, I think, to follow through on that. But we have a whole community, our local community. Hey, we ask you, please go out and take pictures. If you see it happen, send it to us, and then it's our job to say, is this real? And we need to do a good job at that. And sometimes it takes some time, but it gets us in a lot of places. It helps our coverage, and it gets you involved.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Rick Agron, hailing from Barrington, New Hampshire. I wanted to ask about the role of magazines, because we don't have a magazine person here, but I wondered...
If James.
Go ahead.
I guess I was thinking about things like The New Yorker, which often breaks national stories, which is a place that does long-form journalism in a way that we don't see frequently, or newspapers are able to do. And I wonder if that's that sort of high. I know a lot of them are sort of migrating long long-form journalism to the web. Is there a role for magazines? Is there a role for serialization, like we used to see in the old days, in today's environment for news?
You know, David, one of my friends the other day making a comment on this subject and said, we have a lot of what, but we don't have a lot of so what. Do you think that the rise of more entrepreneurs or what you're seeing around the country anyway, does it help answer some of this, the so what that some of these magazines and long-form journalism can do?
Well, I think, I mean, there are publications like New Yorker. I mean, Time and Newsweek have lost a lot of readership, but they're still there. Sometimes doing quite compelling work, sometimes producing a much thinner product, but more frequently, you know, if you incorporate online. I mean, you know, NPR's in the so what business. Sometimes it was accused of not being enough in the what business, but I think we're addressing that as well. I think newspapers, to be honest, particularly the major newspapers, are kind of a daily miracle. If you look at the New York Times and even the beaten down LA Times, if you look at the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, they are publishing daily magazines. I mean, these are, you know, they have scores of articles in there by people who are exceptionally hardworking specialists, sometimes written long form in very involving style, because they know that they have to compete for your interest. And so they're much more compellingly written than a lot of times they were 20 years ago. So you do have magazines, they just look different. You also, I mean, I think the world of blogs have just, I mean, there's a lot of unimpressive work out there, but you can find some stuff which is extraordinary from academics who knew can write in a way that is compelling and accessible to the greater public. You know, you think of this guy, Simon Johnson, who I believe is at MIT, used to be the chief economist for the IMF. Very interesting guy. He's got a point of view on economics, but he writes very cogently, links to a lot of, I mean, you can think about it for almost any topic you cared about: sports, the law, the environment, whatever. And a lot of time, I mean, the great thing about the web is space is endless. So they can do, heaven knows, they can do long form, and they can do, as every blogger does, serialization, because every blog entry is like a little feuilleton, you know, it just comes out and keeps coming out and keeps coming out. So I think it helps not to view it in the bundle you're used to seeing it in. But it's often there. What was has been diminished, but what is new and evolving is different.
It's tough. The advice I'm given, new to the blogging world, we have a blog on our website, was get content there 5 times a day, because you want to make sure there's something new every time somebody checks it. The idea of having something that you only get to read once a month and it's delivered to your mailbox is just becoming unthinkable to a lot of consumers of news. But there is long form out there, and the Union Leader does series. The Nashua Telegraph did a phenomenal week-long series called Sunshine Week on open government last year. Great long form reporting. And again, my unreadable 7,000-word piece on the New Hampshire Treasury. Print it out, use it as a doorstop, you know, read it over the course of a month and a half in the bathroom. There is good long form information to be had, and the internet is the place to not only deliver it, but archive it, so people will be tripping over that article forever and getting that information, rather than just relying on it being in their mailbox tomorrow.
These will be the last 2 questions. Go ahead.
Peter Buckingham from Raymond. My question has to do with your thoughts about the implications of the New York Times just recently starting to charge for internet usage on there, and what will be the ramifications of that on the different media?
It's your beat, David.
It's my beat, David. The New York Times says, as our new friend has said, you know, next year is intending to implement a metered system whereby you can read, and they don't know the number yet, but you can read, call it 10, 20, 25 articles a month for free, and after that, you got to pay up, because they feel if you're an intense user, this matters to you, and you should want to pay some. This was something they announced just in the last couple of weeks. It was something they had promised to announce in late spring, and then in August, and then in October, and finally this month, because it's been a very difficult thing for them to weigh. I mean, obviously, When you start charging, you narrow your audience down, and when you narrow your audience down, suddenly advertisers aren't willing to pay as much. It's something people in my old business and the television business know all too well. So the question is, will metered work? One of the things that the Times studied this actually pretty intensely, and I've spoken to some senior executives there about this. They looked at the public radio model, so they thought, hey, people do love the New York Times who read it and who pay for it. Could we get people just to contribute voluntarily? Can we give them tote bags or mugs? It's our deal, but can we give them something that they want from us? Should we just say, okay, everybody has to pay for online readership? What's going to work for us? And they really struggled with this because you really start to narrow your audience, and it narrows your influence as well as your financial gains from it. So they studied institutions that have succeeded at charging. Bloomberg, for example, Bloomberg News. People have heard of it, but most people outside the financial world don't know that consumers are charged about $1,600 to $2,000 a month for a very specialized proprietary terminal that slices and dices data that you didn't even know existed in a way that is beyond what you can do with Yahoo Finance or other free tools on the web. And it's extraordinary, and it marries basically their news operations is like this boutique shop add-on to their financial slicing and dicing. So what they're in the business to do is to provide you information you can act upon to invest in an almost immediate fashion. So people are willing to pay good money if they think that this will give them business advantage, and particularly if they think it's going to be everyone who they're competing with is going to have that information. They feel they can't do without it. People pay for ESPN premium content if they're obsessive about college sports or other kinds of athletics. People pay for Consumer Reports because they think this is an advertising-less publication and outlet that assesses consumer goods that I might want to purchase. I trust them. I'm willing to pay them for that. There's a series of outlets that the Times had to study for this. And the question is the Times so much a part of the texture of people's news consumption that for general news, they can get people to pay beyond the first handful of articles? It is being looked at throughout the news business. They are clearly the leader for news outlets. I do want to offer one add-on, which is the Newsday, which is the major paper that serves Long Island, and is a great tradition, was sister publication of The Sun and the LA Times. Newsday was taken over by Cablevision, the major cable provider, and they said, anyone who is not a subscriber to Newsday or who takes broadband internet service through our Opt Online, I think it's called, internet service, will have to pay. They'll have to be an online subscriber. It'll be a reduced rate from what you'd pay for a print subscription, but you have to pay. It was revealed in a staff meeting that of their hundreds of thousands, this week, of their hundreds of thousands of subscribers, that they got 35 extra people to pay in all of Long Island and all of New York State. For
Like
the
$600 a year or something like that, yeah.
35 people. That is not a revenue stream. So there are some real challenges there. Some thoughts.
Last question.
Yes, my name is Greg Wallace. I'm a senior here studying politics and communications, and we're just talking about the New York Times. The New York Times just hired a social media editor, and I'm wondering, my generation spends a lot of time on social networking sites, be it Facebook or Twitter. What is the future of delivering news through social networking sites?
Charlie, if we can get you a little bit on the Times question in terms of pay meters and then also on the social media. Is it more than marketing, or is it also part of the journalism too?
I think it's part of the journalism, because I don't think you tell a story the same way through social media as you would through traditional media. I think that's self-evident. Matter of fact, I don't think you tell a story the same way through social media as you would through a now traditional newspaper-based website. It's going to take a new generation familiar with the strengths of social media to use whatever follows Facebook and Twitter to really take advantage of these developing technologies. And I say whatever follows because I think what we see now will once again be as forgotten as MySpace or Friendster or some of the others in 3 or 4 years. This is moving too fast to focus on any one provider. What Dave was talking about with Newsday is fascinating. The number 35 subscriptions that we've all heard this week, those of us in the business, is on one hand a shot across the bow, reminding us all how difficult it is to get the public to pay on a regular basis for news content over the web. However, I think there's a couple of subtexts to that story that are very important. One, Newsday is in an unusual situation because of the Cablevision ownership. And I think that the fact you have the dominant newspaper on Long Island owned by the dominant cable system points to the sort of cooperation and new marriages we're going to have to see in the media world. 10 years ago plus, you saw very little cooperation among New Hampshire TV stations, radio stations, newspapers. Everybody competed in the old-fashioned ways. That began to break down slowly. It's happening faster and faster. Look at today's Union Leader. You will see a package done in cooperation with New Hampshire Public Radio, and the Portsmouth Herald is actually a third partner in that economic series. There's going to be a lot more of that. Watch for this really within a couple of months. I think you'll see cooperation among New Hampshire newspapers in a style you've never seen before. That is a way in which the old business models are breaking down, and I think you'll find it to be a way that's going to give strength as these papers are able to focus locally but share information.
Let me ask the audience, who gets a newspaper made out of dead trees delivered to their door each morning? Who's on Facebook? I think it's kind of important, and I push every story I do. Well, not every story, but if I push a story that I think has some interest, I push it out on Facebook and Twitter. And I was an anti-Twitter snob a year ago. I mean, you can't tell a story in 140 characters. It's just ridiculous. But what I realized is you can write a headline and put in a link, and you can get people's interest. And if they want to know more, they get to decide what to do. And I skim the Twitter feed, and yeah, 90% of them I ignore. But that other 10% is something interesting. It's a little nugget of information I wouldn't have known. And I follow the link, and I find out what they're saying. And it's information is great. I love any way to communicate information. And social networking does that. And what it does, instead of having the authority of the New York Times, it's the authority of your friend. And you trust that the link your friend puts up is going to be worth reading. And that's credibility that any of our news outlets would die to have.
Great. On that note, I want to thank the Institute of Politics for putting this on, Grant, and the Josiah Bartlett Center for thinking of this idea, and thank our panelists and David for coming from New York. Thanks everyone for coming. Appreciate it.
Jim, essentially you said what I needed to say, but on behalf of all of us at the college at St. Anselm and everybody here at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, we thank each and every one of you for some very, very perceptive thoughts and a lot to make us think about. One of the things that certainly occurs to me, without dealing with quibbling and issuing and so forth on each of your points, is it makes me think how important it is to have an education such as St. Anselm endeavors to provide. The whole idea of a consumer of news causes me trouble, because I'm used to thinking of readers of news. They're also viewers of news and listeners of news. And all of these people who consume news, of course, are citizens. And each of these citizens is a human person, a man or a woman. And I would add, each of them is a soul. Each of them needs to know something of the truth and strive for it. The democratization of the media is very interesting. We also need to keep in mind, how do we ascertain truth? It's not for anybody to impose truth on anybody. It's for them to discover truth through all of the processes, I think, that God gives us, and education is certainly one of them. So I thank you all, and good luck to each and every one of you in your multiple endeavors. Thank you. Our students have some gifts to present to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Oh, me too. Look at that. Lovely.
Oh, glad to do it.
It's really nice. Fantastic.
It sounds like a Peggy Noonan phrase. It feels right. Yes.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for hosting us today. Appreciate it. Well, we apologize for that, but yeah, it's nice. It's
that back, dude. This time. Thanks for your question. Appreciate it.